special interest groups. Here's a question for you. Statistically speaking, who is the most dangerous driver, meaning they are most likely to cause an accident that does damage to property or injury or causes injury or death to a person? A driver who is legally drunk, that is a blood alcohol content of 0.08, and legally drunk and hammered are two completely different things. So a driver who is legally drunk, a driver who is very tired or very fatigued, or a driver who is texting and driving. Pick one. If you picked the texting and driving driver, congratulations. The legally drunk driver is the least dangerous, statistically speaking, of these three drivers. A driver who is fatigued is more than 5 times as likely, according to government statistics, to cause a fatal accident as a legally drunk driver. And a driver who is texting and driving, according to government statistics, is more than 13 times as likely to cause an accident as a legally drunk driver. Next question. Which driver faces the harshest penalties in the state of Tennessee if they were to be caught, accident or not? A legally drunk driver, a very tired driver, or a texting and driving driver? If you picked the legally drunk driver, congratulations. That person is in the most legal trouble if they were to be caught, accident or not. The penalty in the state of Tennessee for driving under the influence at 0.08 blood alcohol content is the loss of the license for 1 year and 11 months and 29 days in jail, all but 48 hours of which can be suspended on the first offense. There is no criminal penalty for driving while fatigued, although that driver, if they caused an accident, could be open to civil charges. And right now in the state of Tennessee, the texting and driving is a secondary offense and it's a $50 fine. They are considering in the state legislature legislation that would make it a primary offense and increase the first offense fine to $250. So why the discrepancy? If the legally drunk driver is statistically speaking the safest of these three drivers, why does the legally drunk driver have such a much more harsh penalty than the other two drivers? There are lots of reasons for this situation, and there's lots of answers to this question, but one very important. The work of Mothers Against Drunk Drivers has resulted first and foremost in the establishment of a threshold for determining legal intoxication, first at blood alcohol content of 0.1, now at 0.08. They have been successful at standardizing these laws across the country. They have successfully implemented pretty harsh penalties for first offenses. They have done excellent public outreach and public education, designated driver campaigns, and educating the public against the practice of drunk driving. And so they've been very sympathetic, and they've been very successful, and there's a lot of reasons for their success. First of all, they're a group that is pretty nonpartisan and a group that everybody can support, because who doesn't support Mothers Against Drunk Drivers and mothers and fathers who have lost children and other family members to drunk driving accidents? Secondly, there is not an organized group that opposes them, and thank God for that, right? So there's not an organization out there that is pro drunk driving pushing legislation to that effect. So they've been very successful, and they're an excellent example of what a special interest group can accomplish in American society and in American politics. So what is a special interest group? A special interest group is a very narrowly focused group organized around a particular interest, and they lobby Congress and other lawmaking bodies for legislation that they find beneficial. Special interest groups are not political parties. They do not seek to win elections. They seek to influence legislation. They do not run candidates for office, although they do support or attack candidates for office. And they are not very broadly focused in terms of issues or trying to attract voters or a membership. Special interest groups are very narrowly focused. Special interests are bad words in the American political lexicon. And despite the fact that they're bad words, they are an integral part of the American political system. What you see here on this slide is called an iron triangle. And an iron triangle is an informal, yet very real means of policy production or a means of law production. Okay, you can see on the three corners of the triangle, one corner is Congress, very specifically congressional committees that deal in particular areas of legislation. One corner of the iron triangle is the interest group who is interested in legislation of a particular topic. Okay, and the third corner is the bureaucracy. We'll study the bureaucracy in the fourth unit, but these bureaucratic agencies actually implement policy. So the iron triangle is this informal means by which policy is produced, and the production of policy takes all three of these components. Special interest groups, even how much Madison hated them, and we know that Trump railed against them in the campaign, and President Obama did the same thing too. Nobody likes special interests, yet they are a fundamental part of the policymaking system in the United States. If we took them out, okay, if we took the special interest group out of this triangle, it wouldn't be complete. It would be missing a whole side. Stuff wouldn't get done. The reason that they are involved in the legislative process is because they represent an interest, and members of special interest groups and their representatives who work with elected officials tend to have a great deal of expertise in their area of interest that regular members of Congress tend not to have. Okay, there are all different kinds of special interest groups. There are all different kinds of special interest groups. The American Medical Association is a professional association that represents the interests of physicians across the country. This would be things like the Bar Association, etc. They represent members of various professions. Labor unions who represent workers in different industries are special interest groups. There are also special interest groups, very effective ones too, that are literally organized around a value or an interest, like the NRA or Right to Life. Special interest groups bring money, organization, and influence to the political process. Most Americans do not belong to a special interest group, and those that do tend to be of a higher socioeconomic status, and they have real influence. Consider what the hyperpluralists say, that groups shout down the voice of average citizens, of regular people in the political process, that they have undue influence. They don't run the show. They certainly do have their critics, but they don't run the show. But they do have a lot of money, and they do have a lot of knowledge and a lot of organization. It does make them very influential in the political process. There is strength in numbers, and essentially access and money and organization gains them access to political leaders. Okay, so let's look at some different kinds of special interest groups and some particular special interest groups, and talk about what makes an interest group successful. The American Association of Retired Persons, the AARP. This is a political powerhouse right here. The AARP is a political powerhouse. A very potent special interest group. They have a very large membership. They represent the interest of older Americans age 55 and older, who we know are very good voters, very politically engaged. They have a very large membership. This organization is expert at the political process. They are expert at policy. They have a ton of money, and they are very effective lobbyists. Now, the AARP is an example of a special interest group that has what's called a very large potential membership. There are lots of Americans out there age 55 and older, so they have a very large potential membership. One of the things that makes interest groups successful is having a very small gap between their potential membership and their actual membership. And so if most of the potential members of any particular group are actually members of that group, that is something that increases the power and influence of the special interest group. So that a group like the AARP, who very arguably benefits all older Americans, or a labor union that would benefit all workers in one particular industry, they have this problem of large potential memberships, and how do they shrink the gap between their actual and their potential memberships, and how do they keep people from essentially freeloading, from taking the benefit of the group without contributing either in numbers or in service to the group or in a financial way to the group. There's lots of ways that groups do this. The AARP does this by being very highly organized. They have the population down. People will get their enrollment form, their membership form for their 55th birthday. It'll come to them in the mail, so they do really good outreach to potential members. They have a wide variety of benefits that are available to members, discounts, and if you look at their website, there's all kinds of recipes and lifestyle tips. The AARP even runs an online dating service for older retired adults. So you see, if you join the AARP, you get all kinds of what are called selective benefits beyond the political benefit of membership in the group. Having a very small gap between their actual and potential membership is something that makes professional organizations really rather successful. People who are in the professions, who are doctors, who are lawyers, who are accountants, who are architects, who are engineers, they belong to their professional organization, their professional association. So these groups have very small gaps between their actual and potential memberships. They're also very narrowly focused, and the range of focus of a special interest group is something that can contribute to their success. A group that is more broadly focused is trying to accomplish a lot of different goals, is working on numerous different pieces of legislation, might not be as successful as a group that's very narrowly focused. Okay. Like a professional organization like the AMA would be. Labor unions, we talked about, are still strong and important, but they are struggling in the current and economic and political climate with this gap between potential and actual membership. And so while they remain very, very relevant, they are a type of special interest group whose overall power and influence has decreased. In the American political system, corporations function very much like special interest groups. They carry out all the same functions. They carry out all the same things. And so a corporation is a corporation but they're also special interest groups. They also engage in many of the same activities that special interest groups do, and they certainly are very interested in representing their interest to Congress and other legislative bodies. And then, of course, there are what are called single issue groups. And these are groups that are organized around a value or an interest. The National Rifle Association, the National Right to Life Council, Greenpeace, which is interested in the environment. The key to the success of these organizations is in the intensity of their members. They attract a membership of people that are true believers in the cause that they represent, and this really helps to make these groups effective. We'll talk when it comes to elections, we'll talk here in just a couple of minutes about the effectiveness of a group like the NRA who reaches out to their members in favor of a candidate or against a candidate, and they're very successful in that particular manner. So these single issue groups tend to have intense and dedicated members, and this leads to their overall success. I just like this picture. This is a statue of Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So I think these people are pretty intense. There are special interest groups that represent the rights of or the interests of people who are marginalized in society or who have been discriminated against. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People has been hugely effective across the course of the 20th century. They have done a lot of good work. The Southern Poverty Law Center is an example of another example that comes to mind of this kind of group. But there's many groups in the American political system, many special interest groups that represent the interest of people who cannot or are not able to effectively speak for themselves. And so people who have been marginalized, children and others, even animals or something like that. This is Ralph Nader, who was really a pioneer in the 1970s for consumer protection. Groups representing consumers, representing the interest of consumers. For consumers, the American consumer being such a big population of people with a wide and diverse range of interest, groups representing consumer interests have really been quite successful just through their organization and ability to call attention to particular causes. And something like consumer protection is really important because groups exist in the political system to lobby on behalf of and to seek favorable legislation to protect consumers, etc. It's important that they exist because individuals as consumers, if they are hurt by a poorly made product or a negligent company or something like that, there's not very much they could effectively do on their own. There would be very little recourse there. So consumer protection is an area where the organization of special interest groups around that particular issue has been very important and very successful. So what do special interest groups do? They lobby. Lobbying is the making of face-to-face direct contact on behalf of a group about a specific issue or piece of legislation with the person making the law. It is called lobbying because for years and years, these people stood in the lobby of the Capitol building, or they stood in the lobby of boarding houses where members of Congress lived, and they ambushed them. Lobbying can be very formal or it can be very informal, and it is widely practiced at all levels of government, and it is as old as politics itself. It is something you guys probably engage in all the time. And it's effective. It works. That's why it's there. Lobbyists however, this is where special interests kind of get their bad rap, their bad name, and it's not entirely deserved. We all have images in our heads of lobbyists spending all kinds of money on elected officials, buying them gifts, wining and dining them, taking them to play golf, taking them on these great trips in order to essentially buy the vote of that lawmaker for legislation that they wish to see passed. That exists to some extent, but lobbying is very tightly regulated now. People who make any direct contact with a lawmaker on behalf of a group have to register, and this is true at the state level and at the national level. All gifts have to be disclosed. Every member of Congress has to disclose any kinds of financial gift they've received or the dollar value of something like I don't know, a game of golf or whatever it is that they do, and there are very strict limits on all of this. Despite the laws and the very strict limits, there are big loopholes and there's a lot of gray area here. And so we Americans, we tend to have this idea of the, quote, special interest using their lobbyists to buy the votes of lawmakers. Not so much. That's not really the reality of what they do. Lobbying can be effective, and lobbying does happen, and it certainly has its place. But the main point of a lobbyist, the main purpose of a lobbyist is to bring information to the elected officials, to serve as an expert, to serve as a source of information. They help to write bills. They testify before congressional committees, and they do try to persuade members of Congress or members of state legislatures or city councils or whatever. Now, lobbyists are an important source of information. Very often, the lobbyist, the special interest group, is the expert. I really like this cartoon, Paul Revere. The British aren't coming, the facts are coming here, and everyone's running, they're scared. Lobbyists cannot lie to members of Congress. That's a sure way for them to lose their job. But they are, of course, allowed to give very one-sided and very biased information. Okay, so consider you get your test back and you made an 80 and you put all this effort into telling your mom why this is not such a bad grade. And you're like, Mom, it's actually above average. And Mom, there were 5 or 10 people in the class who did worse than me. You're not lying to Mom, but what you're doing is called spinning. You are presenting very biased and one-sided information. And of course, this is what lobbyists do, and lawmakers need to work their way through that. But they have to do that. They're representing an interest. Lobbyists are often criticized as being controlling, as actually controlling the political process. We perceive them as really being the puppet masters, and the elected officials being then the mouthpieces of the special interest. And this goes back to this idea that the special interests just have too much influence. Now, whether or not they're the real power players, they're the puppet masters, that's debatable. Really, at the end of the day, elected officials are independent, but there's certainly reason for this idea. There is a street in Washington, D.C. called K Street, and upon K Street there are a number of prominent lobbying firms, and so you will hear K Street used in the news or in the political talk as a stand-in for all special interests and all lobbyists. Well, one of the things that President Obama talked about in 2008 when he was first running for office was that he was going to close the revolving door between Capitol Hill and K Street. This is a pretty fair criticism. A lot of people who work for Congress, who serve as congressional aides, who staff congressional committees, are also lobbyists. And this is what President Obama meant by the lobbying door between K Street and Capitol Hill. There's a lot of transfer there. And so in an effort to blunt the influence of the lobbyists and other special interests, early in his presidency, President Obama issued an executive order saying that anybody who was registered as a lobbyist in the previous 3 years could not get a job in the federal government, even in Congress itself, on Capitol Hill, or within the federal bureaucracy. Well, this executive order caused a crisis, and it was unenforceable because there just weren't enough people to fill the jobs, to fill the demand, unless they backed off of that requirement. So there certainly is a tremendous, this revolving door is real, but it's also kind of impossible to close, and President-elect Trump has vowed to do the same thing. President Obama was not successful in this effort, and we'll see if President Trump has any better luck. I doubt that he will. The lobbyists are the experts, and the experts are the lobbyists, and the experts are the people who go to work for the congressional committees and the bureaucratic agencies. The Iron Triangle, y'all, the Iron Triangle. They're on all sides of it. They just move back and forth from one position to the other. Besides lobbying and serving and giving information to elected officials, what do special interest groups do? They do something called electioneering. Electioneering is supporting a candidate, calling attention to a cause, attacking a candidate, as you see here, doing all kinds of election year propaganda to get favorable candidates into office or unfavorable candidates out of office. I have a couple of pieces of propaganda used by the National Rifle Association to show you that because the National Rifle Association was expert at this. They are so good at this particular thing, and they're very good at turning out their membership to vote. They send report cards on candidates, and they're just really good at this. So this was, I remember seeing this billboard in 2004. All right, John Kerry is the pretty little French poodle. I don't think I need to tell you what that's trying to say about him. This had to do with the Obama administration coming in and this fear of really restrictive gun control measures being put into place as a consequence of that. The NRA is so good, they're so effective, that when President Obama was elected in 2004 and he had a Democrat-controlled House of Representatives and a Democrat-controlled Senate, not one bill calling for stricter gun control measures, not one bill was even introduced in Congress. And I recall reading an article that there wasn't even one in the pipeline. The NRA does such a good job of electioneering at really attacking candidates who support gun control and promoting candidates who don't. And this is a landscape that's starting to shift. The NRA, very narrowly focused, very small gap between potential and actual membership, very highly organized, a lot of money, intensity among its memberships, everything that makes a group successful. All right, everything that makes a group successful. There's not really an organization that counters them, but that is starting to change. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that. Aside from electioneering, special interest groups also litigate. Groups that representing environmental interests use litigation a lot. Groups representing discriminating against people or marginalized people use litigation a lot. Consumer protection groups use litigation a lot. And usually the purpose of litigation is to force the enforcement of an already existing law. This cute little bird is called the piping plover, and it nests on the barrier islands off the coast of North Carolina, which is where my family goes on vacation every year. Well, one of the reasons that we love to go on vacation there is very sportsman friendly, and people drive their truck or their SUV out on the beach and they fish and play and do all kinds of stuff. Well, the Audubon Society, which is a special interest group organized around birds, sued the Department of the Interior several years ago over the piping plover, because the beaches are the nesting area for this bird. And they got a federal judge to issue an injunction against any vehicular traffic on the beaches or any foot traffic even on some of the beaches under a part of the Endangered Species Act. This was not well received on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which rely on tourists, and especially tourists who come there to fish and do other things and drive their trucks on the beach. This was not well received by them. And this is a really good example of how interests can work against each other, because here's the environmental issue and the environmental interest working against the economic interest of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, who rely upon these tourists, need these tourists to come. So here's hyperpluralism for you. Both groups, there was an organization called the Outer Banks Preservation Association that was organized directly against this federal court injunction and the Audubon Society. And the last 8 years, there's just been a great deal of mishmash and open beaches and closed beaches, and you can do this, but you can't do that. And, you know, now you got to get a permit and you got to watch a video about not running over animals. And I mean, it's just kind of it's been an interesting but crazy thing. And that's hyperpluralism for you, the two interests working against each other. But it's also the pluralist theory. They are both kind of accomplishing their goals. And, you know, pluralism, of course, says that the best way to work in a democracy is through groups. So, all SIGs have PACs. All special interest groups have PACs. Will you please leave? We are not going to practice until I finish this. All special interest groups have political action committees, which we learned about in the last unit, to raise money on behalf of their interest and to financially support candidates favorable to their cause. Are special interests, are PACs inherently corruptive? I think that's a tough question to answer. Without a doubt, special interest groups have a tremendous amount of influence on the political process, and they certainly have greater access to and influence than individual citizens do. But I don't know that that influence is necessarily corrupting. I don't know that it's necessarily corrupting. What the organization of special interest groups and their expertise of special interest groups and the money of special interest groups gains for their interest is access to the lawmakers. Money gets access. It doesn't necessarily get what it wants. It doesn't necessarily buy a vote. It doesn't necessarily buy an outcome, but it does gain access. And I like this cartoon for showing that. Okay, can the regular person make it to the lawmaker? They can, but it's kind of difficult. All right. The lobbyists get to walk right in. And that's essentially how it works. They good, they bad, that's debatable. They're reality. They're part of the system.